Crispin Glover dances, sleeping bag murders, death curses, and of course, hockey masks on this extra gory edition of Same Name, Different Game. Hello, my name is Joe, and welcome to Same Name, Different Game. How often do you get a Friday the 13th in October? Not very often, as it turns out. The last one was 11 years ago in 2006, a full 5 years before I started doing this show. And the next one isn't until 2023. Which means I better make the most of this opportunity to talk about games based on my favorite slasher movie franchise. So let's get started with a little history. If you're not a horror hound, you may not be aware of the lineage, but Friday the 13th as a series is the highest grossing slasher movie franchise in history, having racked up over $800 million in adjusted dollars at the US box office. It's also arguably the movie franchise that best represents the 1980s, with every year of the decade save 83 and 87 getting an entry, with some of those installments coming less than a year apart. The first film, co-written and directed by Sean Cunningham, was released in 1980. It sees a group of kids reopening a summer camp on Crystal Lake in New Jersey. They're promptly slaughtered by an unseen killer who, spoilers for an almost 40-year-old movie, turns out to be Pamela Voorhees, the vengeful mother of a young boy named Jason who drowned at the camp while the counselors were off having sex and doing drugs instead of watching the kids. The film did huge business, and a sequel was immediately slated for 1981. In Part 2, Jason himself was the killer, but perhaps not the one we expect. He wears a bag over his head and bib overalls, and while this look did inspire video games to be sure, it wasn't quite in the same way as his later appearance. But take one look at Biggie Man in Splatterhouse or the Chainsaw Guy in Resident Evil 4, and it's not hard to see the resemblance. Part 3 gave us my personal favorite entry, at least when viewed in its original 3D presentation, and more importantly the iconic hockey mask which would stick with Jason for the following 7 films, even Part 5 when it was just a guy pretending to be Jason, as well as the crossover with Freddy Krueger and the inevitable reboot which came in 2009. Said reboot kinda sucked, but the original run of films, up to and including the crossover with Freddy Krueger, remain entertaining throughout, with effects in many installments by the man himself, Tom Savini, and creative kills. While the Friday series doesn't reach the high highs of series like A Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it remains much more consistent. And that's why it's my favorite slasher series. Look, if you come to these movies, you know what to expect. Heaps of blood, paper-thin characters, and some weird Reagan-era moralizing by way of a masked invincible zombie murder man. Which is why it's weird that video games come into this anytime before the modern era, and, well, you're probably expecting me to start with the NES game, but as it turns out, that isn't the first Friday the 13th game. I know, weird, right? But it was publisher Domark who released the first Friday the 13th game on a handful of microcomputers, and those were very popular in England, not so much here, and as we've discussed, because of that, I don't really know anything about them. But fear not. I have got Brit and microcomputer aficionado, the almighty Kim Justice, back on the show to help me out here.
Hey y'all, I'm Kim Justice, and I'm here with Joe to take you through some Friday the 13th fun. Specifically the computer version of the game, which came out for the C64, Amstrad CPC, and ZX Spectrum. It's certainly a different game from the other titles, as you might expect. And guess what? It kinda makes the other Friday the 13th games look pretty good. The aim of the three games is simple. You pick one of the teenagers and go on the hunt for Jason. Meanwhile, Jason's on the hunt for all of your friends. In the C64 version, any successful kill is announced by a very loud, piercing scream. What you need to do is to find a weapon, say a chainsaw, and then kill Jason with it. Now the tricky part is that Jason starts out disguised as one of your friends, meaning that you might end up killing a couple of them on the hunt for him. However, once Jason is hit, he appears, as a regular bloke dressed all in black. You kinda have to use your imagination a bit with this one. And that's all there is, pretty much. You have to find and kill Jason before he kills either you or the rest of your friends. Once you find him, he's not that difficult to kill. Really, you just walk away from him and give him a few taps with your weapon. The only trouble you might have is that you might encounter Jason without a weapon, but it's not a big deal to find one. I mean, the game's not that big. It's harder to lose at this game than it is to win, honestly, and it's basically done and dusted in about 5 minutes. Considering that publishers Domark charged £8.95 for the game on release in 1985, it could be said that the game doesn't exactly represent value for money. Even so, the license made it a success. There's really not much difference between the three versions. They're all the same bad game, just with better or worse graphics. The C64 version at least has the screams and some amusingly rubbish music, while the Spectrum version is especially bad because it's impossible to even see who is who due to the terrible sprites. Some have even wondered if this was just some no-mark bad game from Domark that had a Friday the 13th license tacked onto it due to how little it has to do with the original material. And that wouldn't be a surprise. In the end, well, it makes the NES game look pretty damn great by comparison. Don't play it. Cheers, Joe. Bye for now.
Cheers, Kim. And that brings us to the infamous NES version. But like Kim said, next to those Domark versions, this one actually looks pretty good. The copyright screen on the game says 1988, but according to most sources I found, it was actually released in early 1989 and in North America only. Either way, this would put it smack dab between The New Blood and Jason Takes Manhattan, with Aqua Zombie New Blood Jason appearing on this bizarre cover. The game was developed by Atlas, believe it or not, and according to Moby Games, it was one of their first 10 efforts. Friday the 13th for the NES was published by the infamous LJN, while the imprint was owned by MCA Universal, somewhat interestingly, seeing as the Friday the 13th series was owned by Paramount at the time. At any rate, the game is principally a side-scrolling action game, though it does have some behind-the-back third-person segments when exploring cabins and other rooms. There are 6 selectable characters, each with their own stats, but I'll save you some trouble. Chrissy is the best one. Each character starts with rocks, but can quickly upgrade to a knife and later other weapons like a torch and machete. The main enemies are zombies, with some birds and wolves thrown in, and the map is continuous, almost, dare I say, Metroidvania-esque, encompassing the campground itself, as well as the lake, the woods, and a cave. Now, one of the primary criticisms of LJN games is that they don't follow the movies they're based on, and while it's true this game doesn't follow a particular entry in the franchise, it does have several nods to various Friday films. There's a hidden altar with Pamela's head on it, and getting her sweater will give you protection, just like in Part 2. The title screen is clearly a reference to Part 4's poster, which the Domark games also made use of. Finally, the game tells you that fire harms Jason the most, which makes sense since in Part 7, the most recent as of when this game had come out, he had a pretty rough encounter with fire. So beyond its accuracy to the film, which as I've mentioned in the past doesn't have any bearing on a game's actual quality, is the game any good? Well, yeah, actually, I don't think it's that bad. Yeah, okay, put down your torches and pitchforks, alright? Hear me out. Look, this isn't some secret gem, it's not some hidden masterpiece, but this game absolutely, positively gets way more hate heaped on it than it deserves. Yes, none of the counselors are from the movies. Yes, Jason's choice of color palette is a little silly. And yes, the game is obtuse. But you know what? If you take some time to figure it out, totally playable. The big problem is that the game doesn't tell you much of anything, and even the hints that are scattered around don't help much because they only appear when certain conditions are met, feeling random. Just the same, once you know a few things, the game can be beaten in less than 45 minutes and is a fairly fun romp. The controls aren't broken, the graphics are actually pretty good for the time, and the music, while repetitive in the side-scrolling parts, overall isn't bad. The theme that plays inside the cabins is a legitimately great piece of 8-bit music, setting a perfect atmosphere. Sure, zombies that aren't Jason have no place in Friday the 13th, but you need some standard enemies to hack down, or the game would be dull. And it's cool that the counselors have unique stats, even if, as I mentioned, Chrissy is totally the best. Yes, it has problems. Not being able to shoot while jumping is frustrating and oddly not brought up that much in the laundry list of things people complain about this game. The rowboat is some straight up nonsense. Fighting Jason in the cabins can be frustrating, especially on the second and third days. Pamela's head has a weirdly small hitbox. But these things aren't any more frustrating than quirks found in more highly regarded NES titles. Also, the map isn't that hard, folks. Left is always clockwise, right is always counterclockwise. Come on, people. Ultimately, it's clear that this game was made by people who had some love for the franchise, and that shows through. Is it Castlevania 3? No, but very few games are. And that brings us to what I'm sure will be the newest game I cover on this show for a while, if not ever. It's Friday the 13th on the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC. Now, I'm playing the PS4 version, but all versions are basically identical, near as I can tell, and they were released on May 13th of this year. Getting a physical release today, actually, along with some new DLC. So let's take a look. This game has a weird history. It was originally announced as Summer Camp, an asymmetrical multiplayer game set in the classic horror mold of The Burning, Sleepaway Camp, and, well, Friday the 13th. Kids at camp, masked, nigh invulnerable killer, all that stuff. This popped up on my radar pretty much right away, but sometime after the game was unveiled, it was announced that Sean Cunningham himself, director and co-writer of the first film, had contacted the folks at IllFonic and Gun Media and offered them the license. Naturally, they jumped on that, and launched a Kickstarter to realize their vision. Beating their $700,000 goal by over $100,000, the team was in business, and many folks involved in the original Friday films jumped aboard. Harry Manfredini, composer of 9 out of the 10 original film scores, returned to do the music. Effects master Tom Savini helped craft the kills and made an original Jason skin for backers of the crowdfunding campaign. Tom Matthews, who played Tommy Jarvis in Jason Lives, returns to voice that character in the game. And the one and only Kane Hodder, the stuntman who has portrayed Jason more than any other actor, did the motion capture for Mr. Voorhees. But that's all window dressing and fan service. How does the game actually play? Well, the initial reception was a bit rocky. The game had and has some graphical glitches, but the big problem at launch, especially on consoles, was matchmaking. It was apparently taking forever to get into a game on PS4 or Xbox One, if you could get into one at all. Having come to this party late, I didn't have any trouble in that department. The game is, as I said, an asymmetrical multiplayer affair. Up to 8 players are supported, with one taking on the role of Jason and the rest filling out the counselor roles. It works on an experience system like Overwatch, so each kill with Jason is worth some XP. Even if a couple kids survive or escape, you'll still rack up some points. Likewise, counselors earn XP by surviving the 20-minute time limit, escaping via boat or car, calling the cops and escaping down the path, or killing Jason, which is nearly impossible, though it does involve Pamela's sweater, seen in this game as well. Completing various and sundry smaller tasks can get both counselors and Jason some smaller XP bumps as well. Now, let's focus on Jason first, because playing as him is really cool. First, he's got a lot of different skins, but they're not just cosmetic. That experience system unlocks more of them as you go, with different advantages and disadvantages. Some Jasons have exclusive weapons, which means exclusive kills. But I mean, look at all these. You've got Part 2 Jason with the bag on his head. You've got Part 7 Jason with the big chain on his neck. You've got weird, lumpy, boil-headed Part 9 Jason. Oddly, Uber Jason from Jason X is missing in action, but many fans speculate he may come as DLC down the road. But hey, you know what I like? NES Jason. Yeah, that's right. As Jason, you can appear right near folks, you can turn off the music that plays when you get close to counselors, you can sense where the counselors are, and it's almost impossible to kill you. All of this is also affected by which Jason you choose. Some have faster recharge for teleporting, for example. Some can run, while others can't. That kind of thing. I mentioned unique kills, but this game really has a ton of them. There are context kills, like hanging someone on a hook, stuffing them in a lit fireplace, or throwing them out a window. There are weapon kills, like the axe to the crotch. And there are regular old bare-handed kills, like punching a head off, or crushing a skull. And finally, there are hiding kills. The counselors can hide in certain places, but if Jason discovers them, it's an instant kill with no chance to escape. My favorite of these? The infamous sleeping bag kill. And like many others, that kill is a reference to a specific movie moment, which I know fans will get a kick out of as they see them, even if they're the victim. Okay, yeah, but what about playing as the counselors? This was the complaint of many reviewers when the game came out. Playing as the counselors isn't fun. Well, it's not as fun as being Jason, but I wouldn't say it's not fun. The maps are mostly pretty big, and all taken from specific films, and the actions and items needed to get a car working or use the phone to call the cops spawn randomly, so there's always the challenge of roaming the map, avoiding Jason, and getting the items you need to survive. The counselors also have a variety of weapons to stun Jason so they can escape. Shotguns, machetes, wrenches, flare guns, and more. And each counselor, though not characters from movies, with the exception of Tommy Jarvis, do have unique stats in this game as well. Now the Tommy Jarvis thing is pretty cool too. If you use the radio, a random dead or escaped player gets to come back into the game as Tommy, who's required if you want to kill Jason. And as with most online games, playing with friends really helps as you can coordinate more easily. So yeah, it's a fairly unique, well-designed asymmetrical multiplayer game, and a great throwback to the films. For a game on such a relatively small budget, it's pretty impressive, all things considered. So, alright, it's not going to be much of a contest, but let's go ahead and do like we do, and take a look and a listen, side by side.
Time to get out of here.
That's my Jason.
Clearly the current gen version looks the best by most standards, and with new music by Harry Manfredini, sounds top-notch too, but The NES version doesn't look bad by the standards of 1989, and like I said before, I like the cabin music a lot. Seriously underrated. The Microcomputer version is pretty ugly on every platform, sad to say. Jason doesn't even kinda sorta resemble the Jason of the films here. And that makes it time to give the edge. And it's obviously the modern versions. But I will say, if you are a big horror fan and a big vintage gaming fan, particularly the NES, I would implore you to give this one another shot. It's well under 20 bucks these days, which makes it a lot cheaper than A Nightmare on Elm Street for the NES. The Microcomputer versions, I can't really recommend. And on that note, huge thanks to Kim Justice for coming back again for the second time this year and helping me parse this microcomputer business. That's it. That's all I got for you this month. But come back next month, because I will be delivering on an episode I've been promising for a long time. And in the interim, Roger the Retro Gaming Puppet will be back with new episodes for Halloween of both 5 Reasons and Obscure Old Games. You won't want to miss those. Thanks for watching. Have a great Halloween.